In January 1943, the pilots of the 56th Fighter Group refused to fly it into combat. Not quietly, not politely. They complained up the chain of command, wrote letters, and told their commanding officers in plain language that the aircraft was going to get them killed. These were trained combat aviators, men who had already flown the P-40 Warhawk and the P-38 Lightning. They knew what a fighter was supposed to feel like. And this was not it. They called it the Jug, not affectionately. The Republic P-47 Thunderbolt weighed 17,500 pounds fully loaded. It was the largest, heaviest, single-engine, single-seat fighter aircraft the United States had ever put into production. Set next to a Spitfire, it looked like a different category of machine. Now entirely a truck parked beside a sports car. The pilots who had to fly it across the English Channel and into Luftwaffe airspace were by the winter of 1943 openly skeptical that it could survive a turning fight with an FW-190. 8. Fighter Command gave them a direct order. They flew. What happened next is one of the most complete reversals in the history of American air power. By April 1943, P-47s had drawn first blood over occupied France. By August, the 56th Fighter Group alone had destroyed 97 confirmed enemy aircraft. By the end of the war, the Thunderbolt had flown 546,000 combat sorties across 4 theaters of operation, destroyed an estimated 3,500 enemy aircraft in the air, and reduced more than 9,000 locomotives, 86,000 railroad cars, and 6,000 armored vehicles to wreckage on the ground. No American fighter in the European theater flew more missions. None destroyed more of the enemy's capacity to wage war. And yet, by the summer of 1944, at the precise moment the P-47 was doing the most damage in the history of the air war over Europe, the Army Air Forces had already decided to replace it. The orders had been written. The production contracts were being shifted. The future belonged to a smaller, lighter, longer-ranged fighter out of North American aviation, the Thunderbolt. The machine the pilots had refused to fly, the machine that had proven every skeptic wrong over the skies of France and Germany was being shown the door. But the real story of the P-47 Thunderbolt is not the reversal of fortune in 1943, and it is not the institutional abandonment of 1944. It is the story of a machine so fundamentally structurally correct in ways its own operators did not initially understand that it refused at every stage of the war to be written off by the pilots who feared it, by the generals who replaced it, and by the enemy who tried to shoot it down. Every week we tell the stories behind the weapons, the programs, and the decisions that shaped American military power. Give the video a like and subscribe if you want to keep hearing them. The story begins in Farmingdale, New York in 1940. By the summer of 1940, the Army Air Corps had a problem it could not solve with the aircraft it had. The fall of France had taken 11 weeks. The Luftwaffe had operated with near total air superiority over the battlefield, and what the Army Air Corps observers brought back from Europe was not a technical report. It was a warning. The P-36 Hawk, the primary American pursuit aircraft of the moment, had a top speed of 311 miles per hour and a service ceiling of 33,000 feet. The German Messerschmitt Bf-109E, the fighter that had torn through the Royal Air Force over Dunkirk, could reach 354 miles per hour and operated comfortably above 36,000 feet. The gap was not marginal. It was structural, and it was going to cost American pilots their lives the moment they entered a war that by the summer of 1940, the United States had not yet officially joined. The Army Air Corps issued a new requirement in June 1940. The specification was designated XC622, later formalized as Request for Proposals under Circular Proposal 39-775. What it demanded was, by the engineering standards of the day, close to a contradiction in terms. A pursuit aircraft capable of exceeding 400 miles per hour at altitude, armed with no fewer than 8 50 caliber machine guns, with a service ceiling above 35,000 feet and a range sufficient to escort heavy bombers deep into defended airspace. It was to be built around the largest aircraft engine then available in the United States, the Pratt & Whitney R2800 Double Wasp, an 18-cylinder air-cooled radial engine that produced 2,000 horsepower and measured 52 inches in diameter. Fitting that engine inside a fighter airframe that could still climb, turn, and fight was an engineering problem that had no obvious solution. Republic Aviation Corporation had been building aircraft in Farmingdale, Long Island since 1931, founded as the Seversky Aircraft Company by Alexander de Seversky, a Russian-born aviator who had lost his right leg in a World War I combat flight and gone on to become one of the most decorated naval aviators in the Russian Imperial Navy before emigrating to the United States. By 1939, following a corporate restructuring, the company had reorganized under the Republic name, and its chief designer was Alexander Kartveli, a Georgian-born engineer who had studied at the École Supérieure d'Aéronautique in Paris and spent 2 decades solving structural problems that other designers walked away from. Kartveli had already produced the P-35, an all-metal monoplane that had set speed records in 1937, and the P-43 Lancer, which gave Republic its first production contract with the Army Air Corps. He was not a headline figure in the industry. He worked in engineering drawings, not press releases. But inside Republic's design offices, Kartveli was the man who decided what was possible. 4 other manufacturers submitted competing proposals in response to Circular Proposal 39-75. Curtiss-Wright proposed a modified version of its existing P-40 lineage. Bell Aircraft submitted the XP-39 derivative. Lockheed proposed a twin-engine configuration. None built their design around the R2800 Double Wasp at the scale Kartveli was considering. The competing designs prioritized lightness and maneuverability. Kartveli looked at the R2800's dimensions, 52 inches across, nearly twice the diameter of the engines powering the P-40, and made a different calculation entirely. If the engine could not be made smaller, the aircraft would have to be built around it. The fuselage would have to be deep enough to accommodate an exhaust-driven turbo supercharger, a device that compressed thin, high-altitude air and fed it back into the engine, maintaining power at elevations where other fighters were already choking. The turbo supercharger ran on exhaust gases piped from the engine, a forward looped through ducting behind the cockpit and returned to the intake. It added weight. It added complexity. It dictated the entire geometry of the aircraft. And it was in Kartveli's analysis the only path to genuine high-altitude performance with an engine of that size. The Army Air Corps awarded Republic a contract for a prototype on September 6, 1940. The contract value was $1.3 million, covering a single XP-47B aircraft. First metal was cut at the Farmingdale plant in late 1940. The design team numbered fewer than 200 engineers. The timeline from contract award to first flight was set at 18 months. Kartveli had accepted all of the constraints: the weight, the size, the complexity of the turbo supercharger installation. He had looked at what the spec sheet demanded and concluded that the only way to meet it was to stop treating the engine as a problem to be minimized and start treating it as the structural core of the entire design. They were not building a small fighter that happened to carry a large engine. They were building the engine's aircraft. The XP-47B flew for the first time on May 6, 1941, at Farmingdale, Long Island. Republic test pilot Lowry Brabham handled the controls. The flight lasted 12 minutes. When Brabham taxied back to the hangar, the engineering team had one immediate data point: the aircraft had not killed him. That was in the early months of 1941, not a trivial distinction. 3 previous Republic prototypes had been lost to structural failures during test programs. The XP-47B was a fundamentally different order of machine. 11,600 pounds empty, 14,925 pounds at normal gross weight with a wingspan of 40 feet 9 inches and a fuselage nearly 36 feet long. For context, the Supermarine Spitfire Mark V, then the front-line British interceptor and the aircraft, against which every Allied fighter was being measured, weighed 590 pounds empty. The Thunderbolt at combat weight was carrying the mass of nearly 3 Spitfires into the sky on a single engine. The engineering question was not whether the airframe could be built. Kartveli had solved that. The question was whether a machine of this size and weight could perform at altitude the way the Army Air Corps needed it to perform. And the answer resided entirely in the turbo supercharger. The R2800 Double Wasp produced 2,000 horsepower at sea level. At 25,000 feet without forced induction, a piston engine loses most of that power. The air is too thin to support combustion at the rates required for high performance. A conventional supercharger driven mechanically off the engine's crankshaft could recover some of that loss. The turbo supercharger, a turbine driven by the engine's own exhaust gases, spinning a compressor that forced dense air back into the intake, could recover nearly all of it. At 27,000 feet with the General Electric CH5 turbo supercharger operating at full capacity, the R2800 in the P-47 was still producing in excess of 1,700 horsepower. The Bf-109G, the primary German high-altitude interceptor of 1943, produced 1,475 horsepower at its rated altitude with its DB605 engine. The FW-190A, the aircraft the Luftwaffe used to contest Allied bomber formations over Germany, reached peak power at approximately 20,000 feet and fell off sharply above that. The P-47 performed best above 25,000 feet, exactly where the B-17 formations it was escorting flew. The turbo supercharger installation defined every dimension of the aircraft. The exhaust pipes ran from the engine along the bottom of the fuselage. The turbine sat behind the cockpit and below the pilot's seat. The compressed air returned forward through an intercooler, a heat exchanger that cooled the compressed air before it entered the engine, increasing its density and the power output still further. This entire system required ducting routed through the interior of the fuselage, which meant the fuselage had to be deep enough to contain it, which meant the aircraft had to be large, which meant it had to be heavy. Every design decision flowed from that single engineering commitment, and every complaint the pilots would later make about the aircraft's size traced back to the same source. The armament installation was equally uncompromising. 8 Browning M2 50 caliber machine guns, 4 in each wing, each carrying 267 to 425 rounds, depending on the variant and mission loadout. The 50 caliber M2 fired at 850 rounds per minute. 8 of them firing simultaneously delivered a combined weight of fire of approximately 7.7 pounds of lead per second, enough to destroy an aircraft with a 1-second burst and enough to penetrate light armor at combat ranges. No German fighter of the period carried comparable firepower from a single-seat platform. The Bf-109G carried one 20mm cannon and 2 13mm machine guns. The FW-190A carried 2 20mm cannon and 2 7.2mm machine guns. The P-47's 8 50 calibers were a different philosophy of destruction, not surgical but overwhelming. The cockpit sat high in the fuselage, giving the pilot a clear forward view over the massive engine cowling but limited rearward visibility in early variants, a problem that would be partially addressed in the P-47D bubble canopy variant, introduced in 1944, which replaced the razorback fuselage spine. With a teardrop-shaped blown plexiglass canopy offering nearly 360-degree visibility. The aircraft's dive speed was exceptional. The P-47 could reach 500 miles per hour in a dive, a figure that exceeded the structural limits of several German fighters, and allowed Thunderbolt pilots to disengage from a turning fight by simply pushing the nose down and outrunning pursuit. What it could not do, and what would become the central tactical complaint of 1943, was outturn a Bf-109 or an FW-190 at medium altitude in a sustained horizontal engagement. The Thunderbolt was not designed for that mission. It was designed to escort bombers at high altitude to dive through enemy formations, to absorb damage and return to base and to carry ordnance. The damage absorption capacity deserves its own accounting. The R-2800 Double Wasp, being air-cooled, had no liquid cooling system to puncture. A single rifle-caliber round through the coolant system of a Merlin-powered Spitfire, or P-51, could force an immediate engine failure. The same round through a P-47's radial engine might take out one or two of its 18 cylinders and change nothing about the aircraft's ability to fly home. Pilots returned to base with entire cylinders, shot away oil systems, compromised control surfaces, partially destroyed. The aircraft's sheer structural mass, the same mass the pilots had complained about in January 1943, was absorbing punishment that would have destroyed lighter aircraft outright. The first production contract, awarded in September 1941, covered 773 P-47B and P-47C aircraft at a unit flyaway cost of approximately $83,000 per airframe in 1942 dollars. The Farmingdale production line reached a peak output of 4 to 28 aircraft per month by mid-1944, a rate that, combined with the secondary production facility Republic had established at Evansville, Indiana in 1942, made the Thunderbolt the highest volume American fighter aircraft produced in any single month of the war. The 56th Fighter Group arrived in England in January 1943 with P-47Cs. They had 8 weeks of transition training on the aircraft. Then C-8 Fighter Command ordered them into the air over occupied France. The Luftwaffe was waiting. What happened over the next 12 months would settle the argument about the Thunderbolt permanently. The 56th Fighter Group flew its first combat mission over occupied France on April 8, 1943. The mission was a fighter sweep. No bombers to escort, no specific target, just P-47Cs crossing the French coast at 30,000 feet to draw out the Luftwaffe and test what the aircraft could do in actual air combat. The Luftwaffe did not oblige that day. The Germans had studied the new American fighter from intelligence reports and decided initially that the correct response was patience. They would wait for conditions that favored them. Lower altitudes, broken formations, fuel-critical return legs before committing. They did not have to wait long. On April 15, 1943, a formation of P-47s from the 56th encountered FW-190s over the Dutch coast. The engagement lasted less than 4 minutes. One FW-190 was confirmed destroyed. One P-47 was lost. The after-action report noted that the German fighters had disengaged by diving away, a tactic that had worked reliably against Spitfires, which could not follow a diving FW-190 without overstressing their airframes. The P-47 pilots had followed them down without difficulty. That single tactical observation that the Thunderbolt could pursue a diving enemy where the Spitfire could not would reshape the entire fighter doctrine of the 8th Air Force over the following 6 months. By June 1943, 3 fighter groups were operational on P-47s in England, the 56th, the 78th, and the 4th Fighter Group, the latter converted from the RAF Eagle squadrons. A 4th group, the 353rd, was working up to operational status. Between them, they were flying escort missions for the B-17 and B-24 formations of 8 Bomber Command on raids that were by the summer of 1943 reaching into Germany proper. The P-47's combat radius with internal fuel was approximately 175 miles, enough to escort the bombers to the German border and partway back, but not into the heart of the Reich. The solution, improvised in the field by Republic engineers and 8 Fighter Command logistics officers working together at 8th Air Force Headquarters in High Wycombe, was the external drop tank. Initially, 75-gallon paper composition tanks produced under emergency contract in England, later 108-gallon and 150-gallon metal tanks procured from American manufacturers, the drop tanks extended the P-47's effective combat radius to 375 miles with the 108-gallon tank and to 475 miles with the 150-gallon configuration. The tanks were jettisoned before combat, The aircraft returned on internal fuel. The escort range expansion was operationally decisive, but it was not the Thunderbolt's defining contribution to the air war over Europe. That distinction belongs to the period between August and October 1943, the months that the 8th Air Force's official history would later describe as the crisis of the strategic bombing campaign. On August 17, 1943, 8th Bomber Command dispatched 3 76 B-17s to strike the ball-bearing factories at Schweinfurt and the Messerschmitt production facilities at Regensburg, simultaneously a double strike designed to overwhelm German defenses. The P-47 escort could reach only as far as Eupen, Belgium, roughly 50 miles inside German-controlled territory before fuel constraints forced them to turn back. Beyond that point, the bombers flew without fighter cover for more than 400 miles of defended airspace. 60 B-17s were destroyed. Another 27 were so badly damaged they never flew again. Of the 230 aircraft that reached Schweinfurt, 36 were shot down over the target. The loss rate was 19% of the attacking force, a rate that sustained across a campaign would have destroyed the 8th Air Force within weeks. The second Schweinfurt raid on October 14, 1943, Black Thursday, was worse. 60 B-17s lost. 594 American airmen killed, wounded, or taken prisoner in a single afternoon. The unescorted deep penetration doctrine was finished. The 8th Bomber Command suspended all deep penetration raids into Germany until long-range escort could be provided. That escort, when it finally arrived in operational numbers in early 1944, was the P-51B Mustang with its Packard-built Merlin engine and one 650-mile ferry range. The P-51 could go where the bombers went. The argument within Army Air Forces leadership shifted almost immediately. If the P-51 could escort the bombers to Berlin, why continue producing P-47s? But the question contained a false premise. Because between October 1943 and the arrival of P-51s in sufficient numbers in March 1944, it was the P-47, with its extended-range drop tanks, its high-altitude performance, and its ability to absorb battle damage and bring pilots home, that kept the 8th Air Force's escort mission alive. And it was doing something else simultaneously, something that the escort debate had almost entirely obscured. It was learning to kill everything on the ground. The ground attack mission was not in the original specification. It was not what Republic Aviation had designed the P-47 to do, and it was not what Z-8 Fighter Command had ordered the 56th Fighter Group to train for. It emerged from necessity, from geography, and from a property of the aircraft that its critics had spent 18 months treating as a liability. The weight that made the Thunderbolt sluggish in a turning fight also made it structurally capable of carrying external ordnance loads that would have overstressed lighter fighters. By late 1943, P-47 pilots in England had begun attaching bombs to the same hardpoints that carried drop tanks, initially 500-pound general-purpose bombs, later 1,000-pound bombs, and eventually the M8 4.5-inch rocket, a weapon that gave a single-seat fighter the ability to destroy a tank from outside the effective range of its defensive armament. The aircraft's dive characteristics, that same 500-mile-per-hour terminal velocity that allowed it to disengage from turning fights, made it a stable bombing platform. Pilots could roll in from 12,000 feet release at 4,000 feet and pull out with enough airspeed to defeat ground-based anti-aircraft fire by sheer velocity. By the spring of 1944, the mission had a name: the Rail Campaign. Tactical Air Command operating P-47s in direct support of the ground forces that would land in France on June 6, 1944, systematically dismantled the French and Belgian rail network in the weeks before D-Day. Locomotives were the primary target, not because they were the most dramatic objective, but because they were irreplaceable on a short timeline. A destroyed locomotive could not be substituted with a truck or a horse-drawn wagon. It sat on the tracks blocking traffic until it was physically removed. Between April 1 and June 5, 1944, 9 Tactical Air Command's P-47 groups destroyed or damaged 593 locomotives across northern France and Belgium. German logistics planners later testified to Allied interrogators that the rail campaign had reduced Wehrmacht supply throughput to Normandy by more than 50% before the first Allied soldiers stepped ashore. After D-Day, the ground attack mission expanded in scale and lethality. The Kex Tactical Air Command under Brigadier General Otto Weyland operated in direct coordination with General George Patton's Third Army as it drove across France and into Germany. Weyland's P-47 groups flew armed reconnaissance, hunting anything that moved on roads, rail lines, and river crossings ahead of Patton's armor. The results were documented in the post-war United States Strategic Bombing Survey. Between June 1944 and May 1945, P-47s operating in the European theater destroyed 9,000 locomotives, 86,000 railroad cars, 68,000 motor vehicles, and 6,000 tanks and armored vehicles. Those figures represent not a secondary contribution to the Allied victory in Europe, but a primary one: the systematic destruction of the Wehrmacht's ability to move forces, ammunition, and fuel to the front. The Mediterranean theater had been running its own P-47 campaign in parallel. The 12th Air Force and 15th Air Force both operated Thunderbolt groups in Italy from late 1943 onward. The 325th Fighter Group, the Checkertail Clan, flew P-47s over the Gustav Line and provided close air support for the grinding Allied advance up the Italian peninsula. The 57th Fighter Group operated against Axis shipping in the Adriatic and interdicted German supply lines through the Brenner Pass. These were not glamour missions. They were attritional, methodical, and effective. In the Pacific, the story followed a different arc, but arrived at the same conclusion. The V Fighter Command in the Southwest Pacific received P-47Ds beginning in mid-1943. The 348th Fighter Group, based in New Guinea under the command of Colonel Neil Kirby, began flying combat operations in August 1943. On October 11, 1943, Kirby led a 4-ship flight that intercepted a formation of approximately 36 Japanese aircraft over Wewak, New Guinea. Kirby personally shot down 6 confirmed enemy aircraft in a single engagement, an achievement that earned him the Medal of Honor, and demonstrated that the Thunderbolt's high-altitude performance and firepower translated directly to the Pacific air environment. Kirby would finish the war with 22 confirmed aerial victories before being shot down and killed in March 1944. The China-Burma-India theater added a third Pacific dimension. The 10th Air Force operated P-47s against Japanese supply lines on the Burma Road and in support of Merrill's Marauders during the 1944 campaign for northern Burma. The aircraft's range limitations in that theater, the same constraints that had shaped the drop tank program in England, were addressed through forward basing at improvised strips cut from jungle terrain, a logistics achievement that the official Army Air Force's history described as among the most demanding of the entire war. At peak production in the summer of 1944, Republic Aviation's 2 facilities, Farmingdale, New York, and Evansville, Indiana, were collectively delivering 428 P-47s per month. The Evansville plant, which had begun production in 1942 with a workforce recruited almost entirely from local Indiana manufacturing, reached full production tempo in 18 months from groundbreaking. A third facility, operated by Curtiss Wright in Buffalo, New York, produced an additional 354 aircraft under license before the contract was terminated in 1944. At its peak, the P-47 program employed more than 30,000 workers across the 3 plants and sustained supplier relationships in 27 states, a procurement footprint that, while never as politically contested as some later Cold War programs, made the Thunderbolt's production line a significant economic reality in congressional districts from Long Island to the Ohio River. 15 Allied air forces flew the Thunderbolt. The Royal Air Force received 830 aircraft and operated them primarily in the ground attack role in Southeast Asia. The Soviet Air Force received 195 P-47s under Lend-Lease and flew them on the Eastern Front. The Brazilian Air Force's 1st Fighter Aviation Group flew P-47Ds in Italy, with the 12th Air Force completing 445 combat missions between November 1944 and May 1945. The only South American combat air unit to fly operational missions in the European theater of World War II. The French Group de Chasse II of 5 Lafayette flew P-47s over southern France and Germany in the final months of the war. Mexico's Escuadron 201 flew P-47Ds in the Philippines in 1945. By the end of the war, 15 688 P-47s had been built. It was the most produced American fighter of World War II by total airframe count. The aircraft the pilots of the 56th Fighter Group had refused to fly in January 1943 had become by May 1945 the single most numerous fighter aircraft in the history of the United States Army Air Forces. And the Army Air Forces had spent most of 1944 trying to get rid of it. The decision had its roots in a meeting that took place at 8th Air Force Headquarters in High Wycombe, England in the autumn of 1943. General Henry Hap Arnold, commanding general of the Army Air Forces, had been watching the Schweinfurt losses with the attention of a man who understood that the strategic bombing campaign was approaching a crisis point. The unescorted deep penetration doctrine was consuming bomber crews at a rate the training pipeline could not sustain. What Arnold needed was a fighter that could go where the bombers went all the way to Berlin and back. The P-47, even with its 150-gallon drop tanks, could not do that. Its internal fuel capacity of 305 gallons combined with the R-2800's appetite at combat power settings gave it an effective combat radius of roughly 475 miles with maximum external fuel. Berlin was 600 miles from the English coast. The math did not work. The P-51B Mustang fitted with the Packard-built Rolls-Royce Merlin 61 engine had a ferry range of 650 miles and a combat radius with drop tanks that reached beyond Berlin. The first P-51B groups, the 354th Fighter Group operating on loan to 7th Fighter Command from the 9th Air Force, began escorting bombers to targets inside Germany in December 1943. The results were immediate and measurable. Luftwaffe loss rates climbed. Bomber loss rates fell. By February 1944, General Jimmy Doolittle, who had taken command of the 8th Air Force in January, had ordered a fundamental shift in fighter doctrine. Net escort pilots were no longer to stay with the bombers at all costs. They were to hunt the Luftwaffe, find it, engage it on favorable terms, and destroy it in the air and on the ground. It was a doctrine the P-51 was built for. Long range, lightweight, exceptional climb rate, superior performance at medium altitude where most air combat over Germany was occurring by 1944. Arnold communicated his preference to the War Production Board in March 1944. Future fighter production should prioritize the P-51. The implication for Republic aviation was direct. P-47 production contracts would not be expanded. New contracts would go to North American aviation. Republic's leadership understood what was happening. Cartvelli and his engineering team moved immediately to address the aircraft's primary limitation range with a redesigned variant. The P-47N, developed specifically for the Pacific Theater, where over water distances made range the dominant operational requirement, incorporated a new wing with increased internal fuel capacity, raising total internal fuel from 305 gallons to 570 gallons. The P-47N's combat radius with drop tanks reached 800 miles, sufficient to escort B-29 superfortresses from Iwo Jima to the Japanese home islands. Republic secured a contract for 15,000 P-47Ns in early 1944. It was on paper the largest single fighter procurement contract in the history of the Army Air Forces. The contract did not survive the summer. As Allied forces broke out of the Normandy beachhead in August 1944, and the Wehrmacht began its retreat across France, the strategic calculus shifted again. Germany's industrial base was contracting. The Luftwaffe was losing pilots it could not replace. The air superiority mission over Europe was approaching completion, not because the job was done, but because the enemy's capacity to contest it was collapsing. In the Pacific, the Navy's carrier-based fighters, the F-6F Hellcat and the F-4U Corsair, were handling Japanese air opposition with increasing efficiency. The Army Air Force's requirement for a long-range Pacific escort fighter was real, but the scale of that requirement was shrinking. In September 1944, the War Production Board, acting on revised Army Air Force's projections, cut the P-47N contract from 15,000 aircraft to 2,558. Republic Aviation's Farmingdale workforce, which had peaked at 24,000 employees, began receiving reduction notices. The Evansville plant's production schedule was compressed. The Curtiss-Wright license production in Buffalo had already been terminated 3 months earlier. The cuts came in sequence. The P-47M, a high-speed variant, developed specifically to counter the V-1 flying bomb threat over England, fitted with the R-2800-57 engine producing 2 800 horsepower with water injection, was ordered in a production run of only 130 aircraft. The war in Europe ended before most of them reached operational units. The P-47N production line at Farmingdale continued through August 1945. Then the Japanese surrender was announced. The remaining contracts were canceled within weeks. The last P-47 rolled off the Farmingdale line on December 10, 1945. Republic Aviation survived, but only barely, and only by pivoting immediately to jet propulsion, a transition that would consume the company's engineering resources for the next decade and produce the F-84 Thunderjet and eventually the F-105 Thunderchief. The Thunderbolt production workforce did not survive intact. Of the 24,000 workers who had built P-47s at Farmingdale, at peak fewer than 3,000 remained by the spring of 1946. The aircraft itself fared better in retirement than the institution that had built it. Surplus P-47s were transferred to Allied Air Forces under the Military Assistance Program. The Iranian Imperial Air Force flew them into the 1950s. The Yugoslavian Air Force operated P-47s until 1952. The Turkish Air Force kept them in frontline service until 1954. The Brazilian Air Force, whose pilots had flown P-47Ds in combat over Italy, continued operating the type until 1957, 12 years after the war that had produced it had ended. The National Guard units of the United States Army Air Forces flew surplus P-47Ds and P-47Ns through the late 1940s. When the Korean War began in June 1950, several Air National Guard squadrons were still equipped with Thunderbolts. The aircraft was not committed to combat in Korea. The jet age had arrived and the P-47 was finally irreversibly obsolete as a frontline fighter. But the Guard units that flew it into the early 1950s were doing so for a reason that had nothing to do with sentiment. The Thunderbolt, even in 1950, was still the most survivable propeller-driven ground attack aircraft in the American inventory. Nothing built to replace it had yet proven otherwise. The A-10 Thunderbolt II was named deliberately. When Fairchild Republic, the successor company to Republic Aviation, formed after a 1965 merger, won the Air Force's attack experimental competition, in January 1973, the engineers who had grown up inside the Republic tradition understood exactly what they were building. A heavily armored single-seat propeller-driven, in this case, twin-jet ground attack aircraft designed to absorb catastrophic battle damage and bring its pilot home. An aircraft built around its primary weapon, rather than optimized for speed or maneuverability. An aircraft that the fighter community would spend decades treating with institutional condescension, and that would prove in every conflict it entered to be irreplaceable. The lineage was not accidental. It was a design philosophy transmitted across 30 years and a technological generation. Alexander Kartveli had retired from Republic Aviation in 1965. The same year, the merger created Fairchild Republic. He had spent the intervening 2 decades after the P-47 designing the F-84 Thunderjet, the F-84F Thunderstreak, and the F-105 Thunderchief. Each one an aircraft built around the proposition that survivability and payload capacity mattered more than the performance metrics that dominated Air Force procurement discussions. Kartveli died in Manhasset, New York, on July 21, 1974, 18 months after the A-10 contract was awarded, and 13 months before the aircraft's first flight. He did not live to see the machine that most completely vindicated the engineering logic he had applied to the P-47 34 years earlier. The P-47's direct influence on American air doctrine extended beyond the airframe lineage. The rail campaign of spring 1944. The systematic destruction of the French and Belgian rail network before D-Day was the operational template for every subsequent American interdiction campaign. Korea, Vietnam, the Gulf War, the doctrine of using tactical air power to destroy an enemy's logistics infrastructure before committing ground forces drew its operational validation from what 9 Tactical Air Command's P-47 groups had accomplished between April and June 1944. The United States Strategic Bombing Survey, in its 1945 assessment of the European Air War, cited the pre-D-Day interdiction campaign as the single most effective application of tactical air power in the entire conflict. That campaign was flown almost entirely by P-47s. The question of whether the Army Air Forces made the correct decision in prioritizing the P-51 over the P-47 in 1944 has occupied procurement historians for 8 decades. The honest answer is that both decisions were correct for different missions, and that the institutional error was not in choosing the P-51 for escort, but in treating that choice as a reason to diminish the P-47's ground attack role at precisely the moment that role was proving most decisive. The post-war GAO reviews of wartime procurement did not address this question directly. The analytical framework for evaluating tactical versus strategic air priorities was still being developed in the late 1940s, but the operational record is unambiguous. In the 12 months between June 1944 and May 1945, P-47s destroyed more Wehrmacht ground equipment than any other Allied aircraft type. The strategic bombing campaign against German industry received the headlines. The tactical campaign against German logistics won the ground war. Neil Kirby, the Medal of Honor recipient, who had demonstrated the P-47's Pacific potential with 6 kills in a single engagement over Wewak, was shot down on March 5, 1944 by a formation of Japanese fighters he had turned back to engage after his wingman had already broken off. He was 32 years old. His body was not recovered until 1949, when Filipino civilians led Army graves registration teams to a site near Dagwa airstrip in New Guinea. He was reinterred at the Manila American Cemetery, where 17,206 American servicemen are buried, the largest American military cemetery outside the United States. Kirby's final aerial engagement was consistent with everything the P-47 had been designed for and everything it could not protect against the pilot, who turned back for one more pass when the tactical situation had already shifted against him. Francis Gabreski, who had refused to fly the P-47 into combat in January 1943 and went on to score 28 aerial victories in it, the highest confirmed total of any American pilot in the European theater, was himself shot down on July 20, 1944, while strafing a German airfield at low altitude. His propeller struck the ground during a strafing run. He belly-landed the aircraft in a field near Bossenheim. Germany walked away from the wreck and spent the remaining 10 months of the war as a prisoner at Stalag Luft 1. He returned to the United States in May 1945. He flew F-86 Sabres in Korea, adding 6.5 more aerial victories to his total. He retired from the Air Force in 1967 as a full colonel. The aircraft he had called a 7-ton nightmare in January 1943 had carried him through 160 combat missions, without once failing to bring him home until the day he flew it into the ground himself. The P-47 Thunderbolt was not the fastest fighter of World War II. It was not the most maneuverable, not the longest-ranged, not the most aesthetically refined. It was refused by its own pilots, underestimated by its own Air Force, and targeted for replacement at the moment of its greatest effectiveness. It survived all of it, the skepticism, the institutional politics, the procurement reversals, by being in the most fundamental engineering sense. Correct. Correct about altitude performance. Correct about firepower. Correct about survivability. Correct about what a ground attack aircraft needed to be able to carry and absorb and deliver. If you found this history valuable, give the video a like. It's the single best signal you can send this channel. And if you want more stories about the weapons programs and decisions that shaped American military power, subscribe to Defense Archive. We'll see you in the next one. Somewhere over the Moselle River Valley in the autumn of 1944, a flight of 4 P-47Ds rolled in from 12,000 feet, released their 1,000-pound bombs at 4,000 feet, and pulled out at 500 miles per hour, low enough that the pilots could see the locomotive steam venting from the punctured boiler before the valley wall blocked the view. Climbing back into the overcast, already turning north, already looking for the next target on the list.